There are some moments in life that don't destroy you right away. At first, they seem small. A few careless words, a look, a cold look, a room where everyone suddenly turns against you. You tell yourself it's not a big deal. You convince yourself to move on. But those moments never really disappear. They wait, quietly, somewhere deep inside you, until the day life brings them back in a way you never saw coming. A few years ago, I found myself sitting in a room where everyone had already made up their minds about me. No one wanted to hear my side. No one cared what was actually true. Could have argued. I could have defended myself. But something inside me told me not to. So I walked away. Not because I had lost, but because I knew some battles aren't won with words. What I didn't know was that years later, those same people would walk back into my life, completely convinced they still had all the power. They thought they were meeting someone they already knew. They couldn't have been more wrong, because the person sitting in front of them wasn't the same person they had judged all those years ago. And when the truth finally came out, the silence in that room said more than any argument ever could. I never wanted revenge. I never wanted anyone to regret what they did. But sometimes, life has a way of making people face the consequences of the choices they once thought would never matter. And what happened next is something I'll remember for the rest of my life. My name is Claire Ashworth and I am 38 years old. 4 years ago, when my husband Daniel lost his job at 36, his mother sat across from us at her dining room table and told me, in front of the whole family, that I was the reason. Not the market, not the merger that cut 211 jobs in one afternoon. She said a wife who spent her evenings chasing her own ambitions instead of managing his career had no business acting surprised when he failed. Then she looked at Daniel and told him to come home back to the family business where we take care of our own. I sat there in a blue dress I'd bought for $11 at a consignment shop on 4th Street, said nothing, and drove us home. What none of them knew, not Diane, not Frank, not Daniel's older brother Mark, was that I already managed more money than Ashworth Millwork had made in its best year on record. They didn't know because I never told them. I had my reasons, and I'll get to them. 4 years later, when the family company needed $4 million it didn't have, the investor they were courting turned out to be sitting across the conference table wearing my maiden name on a business card, and none of them recognized me until I spoke. If you've ever been blamed for something you were quietly fixing behind the scenes, stay with me. I want to hear about it in the comments, but only if this story actually earns that from you. Hit subscribe if you like stories about people who win by staying calm instead of getting loud, because that's the only kind of story I know how to tell. Now let me take you back 6 years, to before any of this happened. Back when Daniel and I were just two people from very different families trying to build something together. I grew up in Millbrook, Pennsylvania, a town of about 6,000 people organized entirely around a paper mill that closed the year I turned 14. My father was a machinist there for 22 years, and after the mill shut down, he worked the parts counter at an auto shop until his knees gave out. My mother kept the books for 3 small businesses on Main Street, doing all 3 sets of ledgers by hand at our kitchen table long after everyone else had switched to software, because the owners paid her in cash and she didn't ask questions. We didn't have much, but we had dinner together every night at 6, and nobody in my house ever made me feel small for wanting more than what we had. I studied finance at a state school on scholarship and loans, worked 2 internships nobody paid me for, and by 29 I was an analyst at a mid-sized investment firm in Columbus, the kind of place where you learn everything by doing it wrong once and never again. I met Daniel Ashworth at a mutual friend's engagement party when I was 31. He was funny in a way that snuck up on you, patient with waiters, and completely unbothered by the fact that I made more money than he did at the time. That last part mattered more than I understood back then. Daniel's family owned Ashworth Millwork, a cabinetry and custom furniture manufacturer founded by his grandfather in 1962. Based in Colton Falls, Ohio, a town of about 4,300 people built around a courthouse square and a diner called Higgins that's been serving the same meatloaf special since before I was born. Frank, Daniel's father, ran the company. Diane, his mother, ran everything else, including, it turned out, opinions about who belonged in the family and who was merely tolerated in it. I met Diane for the first time at Sunday dinner, 3 months into dating Daniel. She looked at my hands, not my face, when Daniel introduced me, and asked if I did anything with them besides typing. I told her I was an analyst. She said, "How nice," in a tone that made it clear she'd already decided how nice it wasn't, and spent the rest of the meal asking Daniel about a girl named Whitney from his high school class, who now taught 2nd grade and had, in Diane's words, her priorities in the right order. The rehearsal dinner, the night before, was its own small preview of what the seating chart would confirm the next day. Diane stood up to give a toast and spent most of it talking about how proud she was of Daniel's career at Marrow, listing specific projects and clients by name, before turning to me for exactly one sentence. "And Claire, welcome to the family. We're so glad Daniel found someone who makes him happy." No mention of what I did. No mention of who I was outside of the effect I apparently had on her son's mood. My own mother, sitting 2 seats down, reached under the table and squeezed my hand, because she'd noticed it too, and neither of us said a word about it that night. At our wedding, 2 years later, Diane rearranged the seating chart the morning of the ceremony without telling anyone, moving my parents from the family table to a spot near the kitchen doors, 2 tables back, next to the DJ's equipment case. I found out when my mother mentioned, kindly, that the food had come out a little cold by the time it reached her. I never said anything to Diane about it. I filed it away instead, the way I file most things, and kept going. That's the first entry in what became, over the years, a running account I kept mostly in my head and occasionally on paper, not because I was building a case against anyone, but because keeping precise records is simply how I'm built. I read financial statements for a living. I noticed discrepancies the way some people notice a wrong note in a song. It took me a long time to understand that Diane's discrepancies weren't accidents. Daniel tried to warn me, gently, before I ever set foot in that house. On our third date, he told me his mother had a way of deciding, within about 10 minutes of meeting someone, exactly what role they'd play in her family, and then spending the rest of the relationship making sure that person never stepped outside the part she'd assigned them. His older brother Mark had been cast, early and permanently, as the reliable one, the one who stayed close to Colton Falls, took over sales at the company at 24, and never once threatened to outgrow what his parents understood. Daniel had been cast as the one who left, who went to college 2 states away and came home only for holidays, and Diane had never quite forgiven him for it, even though he built a genuinely good career doing exactly what he was good at. When I came along, I think Diane took one look at my scholarship and my analyst job and decided, correctly as it turned out, that I was going to make it even harder to pull Daniel back into the role she'd wanted for him. I didn't understand any of that the first few years. I just thought she didn't like me, which was true, but incomplete. It wasn't personal in the way I originally assumed. It was structural. I was a threat to an arrangement that had nothing to do with me at all, and everything to do with a family that measured love almost entirely in proximity and obedience. 2 things I'd never been especially good at offering anyone, including my own parents who'd raised me to leave Millbrook the moment I had the means to. The one person in that family who never made me feel like a discrepancy was Daniel's grandmother, Lou. Everyone called her Nana Lou. She was 80 when I met her. A retired seamstress who'd made her own wedding dress in 1961 and still hemmed pants for half the county out of a sewing room in the carriage house behind the main property. Lou had outlived a husband, buried a daughter, and developed, somewhere along the way, a total immunity to Diane's opinions. The first time we met, she took one look at me, handed me a slice of buttermilk pie, and said, "You got tired eyes for someone so young. Sit down and eat something." I sat down. I ate something. It was, without exaggeration, the first time anyone in that family had asked me to take up space instead of shrink out of it. By the time Daniel lost his job, Lou and I had a standing Sunday phone call, 4 years running, 90 minutes almost every week, about nothing in particular. She never once asked me what I made or what I did with it. She asked if I was sleeping enough. I started my own firm the year Daniel and I got married. I called it Ridgeline Partners. And I ran it under my maiden name, Whitfield, mostly because that's the name that was already on my licenses and my early client relationships, and changing it seemed like unnecessary paperwork for a business I was building quietly, in the evenings and on weekends, alongside a full-time analyst job I hadn't quit yet. I never hid it from Daniel. He knew every number, every client, every sleepless month. I just never brought it up at Ashworth family dinners because the one time I tried, in year 1, Diane cut me off mid-sentence to ask Mark about his golf handicap. After that, I stopped offering. If they weren't going to ask, I wasn't going to perform. The first 18 months of Ridgeline were, honestly, not glamorous. I had 4 clients when I officially left my analyst job, total assets under management of just under $2 million, and a home office I'd carved out of a hallway closet with a desk that didn't quite fit. Daniel came home from Marrow most nights to find me still working, and instead of asking me to slow down, the way I sometimes worried he might, he'd bring me a plate of whatever he'd made for dinner and sit with me for 20 minutes, not talking business, just being present while I finished a spreadsheet. That's the version of him his family never saw. The one who understood, without needing an explanation, that ambition wasn't a betrayal of a marriage. It was just one more thing 2 people could carry together. Daniel's own career, before any of this started, had never been the family's concern in the way mine eventually became. He'd worked his way up at Merrow Transit over 9 years, starting as a route analyst and ending as a regional director overseeing operations across 3 states, a title Diane mentioned proudly to her book club friends but somehow never asked him a single detailed question about at her own dinner table. His success was acceptable to her because it looked, from a distance, like the kind of success a mother could describe in one sentence to a neighbor. Mine, apparently, required more explaining than she was ever willing to do. Daniel worked for a logistics company called Merrow Transit for 9 years, most recently as a regional director overseeing 3 states. He was good at it. He built relationships that lasted, the kind of manager whose former employees still called him for advice years after leaving. None of that mattered when Merrow got acquired by a larger firm and the new leadership decided, in one afternoon, that regional directors were redundant. Daniel found out on a Tuesday, in a 15-minute video call with someone he'd never met, alongside 210 other people he'd never get the chance to say goodbye to properly. He called me from the parking lot. His voice was steady in the way that means someone is working very hard to keep it that way. I left my own office 40 minutes early and met him at home, and we sat on the kitchen floor with our backs against the cabinets, not talking much, just being in the same room while the shape of the next several years quietly rearranged itself. 3 days later, we had dinner at his parents' house, because it was the second Sunday of the month, and canceling would have required an explanation neither of us had the energy to give yet. That was the dinner where Diane told me I was the reason. I want to tell this part in order, because that's how I lived it, one dinner and one voicemail, and one returned birthday check at a time. I started keeping a small green notebook after that first Sunday dinner, not as evidence, just as a way of staying honest with myself about what was actually happening versus what I was imagining. I still have it. Here's some of what's in it. Item 1. 3 weeks after Daniel lost his job, Diane called our house phone, the landline we kept only because Nana Lou preferred it, and left a message for Daniel suggesting he come home and clear his head, for a while, alone, no mention of me. Daniel deleted it without playing it for me twice. I heard it once, standing in the hallway, and said nothing. Item 2. 5 weeks in, Frank called Daniel directly and offered him a position at Ashworth Millwork as Director of Operations, a real job with a real salary, $41,000 a year less than he'd made at Merrow, but stable. The offer came with a condition, spoken gently but clearly. Frank thought it would be good for Daniel's head to be somewhere he wasn't, in Frank's words, competing with his wife's schedule. Daniel turned it down. Not because the money was bad, though it was, but because taking it meant conceding something he wasn't ready to concede. I never asked him to turn it down. I told him that night, and I meant it, that I would support whatever he chose, including moving to Colton Falls, including him working for his father, including anything that got him back on his feet in a way that felt like his own feet. He looked at me for a long moment and said, "I know you would. That's exactly why I'm not doing it." I didn't fully understand that sentence for almost 2 years. Item 3. 3 months in, my 34th birthday. Diane sent a card with a check for $200, made out to Daniel only, with a note that said, "For groceries, since things must be tight." Things were not tight. My firm had closed its best quarter to date the month before, 46 new clients, and I'd quietly put $11,000 into an account earmarked for whatever Daniel needed next, no strings, no announcement. I never cashed the check. I mailed it back with a thank you note and nothing else. Diane never mentioned it again, which told me everything about why she'd sent it in the first place. Item 4. 4 months in, at a family barbecue, Diane introduced me to a neighbor as Daniel's wife. She does some kind of office work in Columbus. In the same breath, she used to describe Mark as the one who runs the company now, practically. I'd closed a client relationship worth $900,000 in managed assets that same week. I said nothing, ate a hamburger, and complimented the potato salad, which, again, was genuinely very good. I've decided over the years that being underestimated at a barbecue is not a hill worth dying on. There are better hills. I was saving my energy for those. Item 7. 7 months in, Daniel mentioned, almost offhand, that his mother had asked him privately whether he thought things would be different if he'd married Whitney, the second-grade teacher from his graduating class, the one Diane had brought up at our very first dinner together 3 years earlier. He told me about it laughing, trying to make it small, but I watched something tighten in his jaw as he said it, and I understood that he was absorbing more of his mother's disappointment than he was letting on, carrying it quietly the same way I was learning to carry mine. Daniel handled all of this with more grace than I think I would have managed in his position. He never once asked me to defend him to his mother, never once suggested I should try harder to win Diane over, and never once let his own hurt turn into something he took out on me. The closest he came to venting was late one night, about 6 months in, when he finally said quietly, staring at the ceiling instead of at me, I keep waiting for one of them to ask if I'm okay instead of asking what I'm going to do about it. I didn't have a fix for that. I just held his hand until he fell asleep, which is, I've come to learn, most of what marriage actually is during the hard years. Not solutions, just someone staying in the room. This is where I want to pause and tell you about the other side of that year, because it wasn't only cold. While one family was quietly writing me out of the story, Nana Lou was calling every Sunday at 4 o'clock, same as always, and somewhere in month 4 she started asking a new question at the end of each call. And how's your business, dear? Tell me one good thing that happened this week. Nobody else in that family had ever asked me that question in 6 years of Sundays. I told her about a client whose retirement account had finally recovered from a bad decade, about a young analyst I'd hired straight out of the state school I went to, about small, unglamorous, real things. She listened like they mattered because to her, they did. If any part of this is landing close to home for you, the version where someone shows up small and steady while everyone louder is showing up transactional, I'd genuinely like to hear that story in the comments. Drop where you're watching from too, and what time it is where you are. I read everyone, even the ones that come in months after I post. Either too. Daniel spent most of it consulting, cobbling together contracts through people he'd known at Merrow, making roughly half of what he used to, working twice as hard for it. He was proud in the specific way that made him refuse most of the help I offered, though he let me cover the mortgage without much argument, which told me how much strain he was actually under. Some weeks he'd be up past midnight rebuilding a routing model for a client who'd pay him $800 for 40 hours of work, and I'd sit across the table doing my own numbers, and neither of us said much, and that was fine. Some marriages need a lot of talking to survive a hard year. Ours needed mostly quiet and 2 people who refused to leave the room. I kept Bridgeline growing in the background. By the end of year 2, assets under management had crossed $60 million, up from 38 the year before. I didn't tell his family that number. I barely told my own parents, who would have worried about me working too hard rather than celebrated the milestone, which is its own kind of love, just not the kind that needed announcing. Item 9, month 19. Diane called to invite us to a family strategy dinner about the company's succession plan, a dinner Daniel and I later learned had already happened once without us, 2 weeks earlier, when we were conveniently out of town for a wedding. Mark had been given a formal title change at that first dinner, senior vice president, and a raise nobody bothered mentioning to Daniel until 3 months later in passing, at a cookout. I don't think the omission was random. I think it was a small, deliberate reminder of where Daniel now stood in a company he'd once been groomed to inherit half of. Item 14 in the Green Notebook, month 26, Mark, Daniel's brother, made a comment at Frank's birthday dinner, loud enough for the table, about how some people's wives get real busy right when their husbands need them most. Diane laughed. Frank looked at his plate. Daniel's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, and I said nothing, because I had learned by then that responding in that room only gave them a longer version of the story to tell about me later. I finished my meatloaf. I complimented Diane on the green beans, which were, honestly, very good. I have never once in my life let a bad dinner ruin a good vegetable. Year 3 is when Daniel started building something of his own, a small logistics consulting practice he eventually named Tri-Haven Advisors, working out of a converted spare bedroom with the desk I found at an estate sale for $60 and refinished myself over 2 weekends. This was his idea entirely, born out of 9 years of relationships he'd built at Merrow and a hard-won understanding of exactly what regional shipping operations needed and weren't getting from anyone else. I helped where he let me, mostly with cash flow modeling and one very unglamorous spreadsheet that tracked every invoice, every client, every dollar in and out. I never touched the client relationships. Those were his, earned one phone call at a time. By month 31, Tri-Haven had 11 regular clients, and Daniel had, for the first time since the layoff, a month where he made more than he had at Merrow. He didn't tell his parents right away. When Diane eventually asked, at a Sunday dinner, how the little consulting thing was going, he said, "It's going fine," and changed the subject. I watched him do it and felt something between pride and grief. Pride that he'd built it, grief that he'd learned to hide it from the people who should have been asking with open hands instead of appraising eyes. Item 18, month 29, Nana Lou showed up unannounced at our house on a Wednesday afternoon, having driven herself 2.5 hours from Colton Falls at 82 years old, a fact that terrified me more than it impressed me, carrying a quilt she'd spent 4 months making, patterned in navy and gold, the 2 colors from Daniel's high school. She said she'd heard, through the family grapevine, that things had been hard, and she wasn't going to wait around for anyone else to say something useful about it. She stayed for dinner, asked Daniel real questions about Tri-Haven for over an hour, asked me real questions about Ridgeline for just as long, and drove home before dark because she didn't like Ohio highways after sundown. That quilt is on our bed right now as I'm telling you this. Item 20, month 32. At Frank's insistence, Daniel attended a company planning meeting at Ashworth Millwork as a courtesy, nothing formal, just Frank wanting his input on a floor layout change. Mark spent the meeting redirecting every question Frank asked Daniel back to himself, twice cutting Daniel off mid-sentence to answer for him. Afterward, in the parking lot, Mark told Daniel, not unkindly exactly but not kindly either, that it was probably easier for everyone if Daniel just focused on his own thing and let Mark handle the family business going forward. Daniel didn't argue. He told me later that arguing would have meant admitting how much he still wanted a seat at that table, and he wasn't ready to give his brother the satisfaction of watching him want it. Item 22, month 34. I overheard Diane on the phone with her sister, not meant for me to hear, saying that she worried Daniel had settled by marrying someone so focused on her career that a different kind of wife might have kept him closer to the family, closer to the business, closer to home. I stood in the hallway of her own house and listened to a woman describe my ambition as a defect in her son's judgment. I wrote it down that night, word for word, the way I'd write down a discrepancy in a client's statement, not because I was building toward anything. Because that's simply how I process what hurts. Ridgeline crossed 100 million in assets under management in month 36. I remember the exact date because it was also the day Daniel signed his largest single contract at Tri-Haven, $93,000 over 18 months with a regional grocery chain. We celebrated together, quietly, at the kitchen table, two people who'd spent 3 years rebuilding two separate things at the same time and had somehow managed not to let the pressure crack the marriage in the process. That night felt like the real turning point, though neither of us knew yet how loud the next one would be. Item 22, month 38. Tri-Haven signed its $93,000 contract with the regional grocery chain, and Daniel, in a moment of hope I understood completely, decided to tell his parents about it at the next Sunday dinner, thinking real, measurable success might finally shift something. Diane's response was to ask whether the grocery chain's headquarters was somewhere respectable, and Frank's was to ask, gently but pointedly, whether this meant Daniel had given up on ever coming back to Ashworth Millwork. Neither of them asked how he'd landed the deal, what the work actually involved, or whether he was proud of himself. He was. He just stopped waiting for them to notice. Item 23, month 40. I hit a milestone of my own that month. My first client referred entirely through word of mouth from another client, rather than through any marketing effort on my part, a sure sign that Ridgeline's reputation had started to carry itself. I mentioned it briefly at a family dinner, mostly to see what would happen. Diane said, "That's nice, dear," and asked Mark's wife about kitchen renovation contractors before I'd finished my sentence. I didn't try again after that. Some doors you only need to knock on once to know they're not going to open. Item 24, month 41. Diane hosted a family portrait session with a professional photographer, the kind of thing she did every few years for the holiday card. She scheduled it, we later learned, on the one weekend Daniel had already committed to a client site visit for Tri-Haven, a visit he couldn't reschedule without losing the account. When he explained, apologetically, that he couldn't make it, Diane told him it was disappointing but not surprising, and the card that went out that December included Frank, Diane, Mark, Mark's wife, and their 2 kids. Daniel and I weren't in it. Nobody asked us to send a photo to be added separately. I found out about the card from Nana Lou, who called specifically to tell me she thought it was wrong, and that she'd told Diane so to her face, which apparently hadn't gone over well. If you've ever been quietly edited out of a family photo, literally or otherwise, I want to hear about it. Tell me in the comments, but only if this is actually resonating with you and not just something you're skimming past. For everyone still with me, this is where the story starts to turn, so stay close. Year 4 is when things started moving faster, on both sides, and neither side knew about the other's momentum yet. Ashworth Millwork had been quietly struggling for longer than any of them let on outside that house. Frank had taken on debt during the pandemic to keep the workforce intact, a decision I respected even from the outside, and the company had never fully recovered its margins after material costs spiked. By the start of year 4, Ashworth Millwork owed one of its lenders just under $3 million, coming due on a schedule the company couldn't meet without new capital. Mark, who'd taken over more of the day-to-day operations as Frank slowed down, had spent the better part of a year quietly shopping for investors, without much luck, because a family-run cabinetry manufacturer in a town of 4,300 people isn't exactly a hot ticket in most portfolios. Daniel and I knew none of this at the time, obviously. We only heard, through the same secondhand channel everything traveled through in that family, that the company had tightened its belt a little, which from Diane always meant something closer to a genuine crisis than a minor adjustment. She was constitutionally incapable of describing bad news accurately if there was any way to make it sound managed. Meanwhile, Ridgeline had grown into a firm managing $181 million across 206 client accounts, with a growing specialty in exactly the kind of situation Ashworth Millwork was in: mid-sized manufacturing companies that needed patient capital and operational discipline, not a hedge fund looking to strip them for parts. I'd built that specialty on purpose, over years, without ever once connecting it in my own mind to the family across the state who'd spent 4 years treating my career like a rumor they were too polite to confirm. I'd hired 2 more analysts by then, both women in their 20s who reminded me a little of myself at that age, hungry and underestimated by somebody, somewhere. Trihaven, on Daniel's side, had grown to 15 clients and a projected annual revenue north of $400,000, numbers that would have stunned his family if they'd ever bothered to ask. Ridgeline, meanwhile, had grown into a firm managing $181 million across 206 client accounts, with a growing specialty in exactly the kind of situation Ashworth Millwork was in: mid-sized manufacturing companies that needed patient capital and operational discipline, not a hedge fund looking to strip them for parts. I'd built that specialty on purpose, over years, without ever once connecting it in my own mind to the family across the state who'd spent 4 years treating my career like a rumor they were too polite to confirm. The pivot happened on a Thursday in April, month 49 since Daniel's layoff. I got a call from Renata Okafor, a friend from business school who now worked at a regional investment bank in Columbus, the kind of casual catch-up call we did maybe twice a year. Near the end of the call, almost as an afterthought, she mentioned she'd just wrapped up a preliminary conversation with a small Ohio manufacturer looking for a capital partner. Cabinetry company, she said. Family-owned, decent bones, needs about $4.2 million to refinance and modernize a production line. You know anyone who does patient capital in that range? I asked, out of pure professional habit, what the company was called. Ashworth Millwork, she said. Little town called Colton Falls. I sat with that for a long moment before I said anything. Then I asked her, carefully, whether she knew the family behind it. She said she'd only met with the operations lead, someone named Mark, and the father, Frank, who'd introduced himself as the founder's son. She had no idea I had any connection to them at all. Renata knew me only as Claire Whitfield, managing partner at Ridgeline. I'd never once mentioned my married name to her, because it had genuinely never come up. I didn't say anything to Daniel that night. I needed to think first, the way I think about everything that actually matters, slowly and on paper. I pulled Ashworth Millwork's public filings, the ones available through the state and through their lenders' disclosures, and I spent 3 hours at my kitchen table doing exactly what I do for a living, reading the real story underneath the numbers. What I found was a company that was fundamentally sound, well-managed on the production side, undercapitalized, and about 14 months from a very serious problem if nobody stepped in. I also found, buried in a supplemental filing, Mark's name listed as a contact, and a note that the company was actively seeking introductions to any investor with patient capital and manufacturing experience. I told Daniel 2 days later, at our kitchen table, the same table where we'd celebrated month 36. I laid out exactly what I knew. His family's company was in real trouble, they were quietly shopping for an investor, and my firm was, on paper, close to a perfect fit for the deal they needed. I asked him how he wanted to handle it, because this was his family, not mine, and I wasn't going to make that call for him. He was quiet for a long time, then he said something I've thought about often since. Let them find out the way they'd find out about anyone else. Don't soften it for them just because they're my parents. They didn't soften it for you. 9 days after that conversation, Mark texted Daniel a screenshot, apparently forwarded by accident from a family group chat that still included Daniel, even though he rarely posted in it anymore. The screenshot was a conversation between Mark and Diane. I'm not going to read you every line, but I'll give you the part that mattered. Mark had written, "Found a firm that might work, Whitfield Capital or Ridgeline or something, run by some woman named C. Whitfield. Renata says she's sharp and does exactly our kind of deal. We should get in front of her before someone else does." Diane had replied, "Good. Make a list of everything we need before the meeting, be specific about the number, and for God's sake don't mention the missed payment to the equipment lender until she's already interested." Mark had responded with a single word, "Obviously." Daniel forwarded it to me without a single comment of his own. I read it twice, standing in my office, and felt something settle in my chest that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite vindication. Mostly it was clarity. For 4 years I'd watched this family treat my ambition as an inconvenience and Daniel's setback as a moral failing that somehow traced back to me. Now they were about to walk into a room and ask the woman they'd dismissed to save the thing they valued more than either of us. I didn't call Frank. I didn't call Diane. I called Renata and told her, calmly and professionally, that I'd take the meeting and that I'd handle the introduction myself. I did one more thing before that meeting, something I hadn't planned on doing but couldn't quite talk myself out of. I called an attorney I'd worked with on 2 previous deals, a careful, unhurried man named Preston Kay, and asked him to review the term sheet I intended to offer, not to make it harsher, but to make absolutely certain it was identical, clause for clause, to what I'd offer any other manufacturer with Ashworth Millwork's exact financial profile. I wasn't building a weapon. I was making sure nobody could ever say, later, that I'd let 4 years of resentment shape a single number on that page. Preston read it twice and told me it was, if anything, slightly generous. I kept it exactly as it was. I told one person outside the deal team what was coming, Nana Lou. I called her on a Tuesday, not our usual Sunday slot, and walked her through the whole thing, the filing, the screenshot, the meeting I'd agreed to take. She was quiet for a moment and then she said, "Well, I suppose Diane's finally going to meet you." I asked what she meant. "She's known you 6 years," Lou said, "and she's never once actually met you. Only the version of you she decided to see." I've thought about that sentence more than almost anything else anyone said to me during this whole stretch of my life. Before we go further, if you've ever watched people scramble to get in good with you right after years of writing you off, tell me about it below, but only if this story has earned that from you so far. I'm not going anywhere. Stay with me, because what happened in that conference room is the part I've been building toward this whole time. Renata set the meeting for a Tuesday morning at Ridgeline's offices in Columbus, not Colton Falls, my building, my conference room, my terms. I did that on purpose. In every negotiation I've ever run, whoever controls the room controls the tone of the conversation, and I wanted this conversation to happen on ground where nobody could rearrange a seating chart without my permission. I told my assistant Priya only that I had a sensitive introductory meeting with a prospective portfolio company, standard language, nothing unusual. I didn't tell her the family's name meant anything to me. I wanted the morning to unfold exactly as it would for any other deal, right up until the moment it couldn't. Frank and Mark arrived at 10 in the morning, 10 minutes early, dressed the way people dress when they're trying to look more solvent than they are. Diane came too, uninvited by anyone but herself, sitting slightly behind the 2 men as if she were there merely to observe, though I knew better than anyone in that room how little Diane Ashworth had ever merely observed in her life. I let Priya seat them in the conference room and bring coffee before I walked in. I wanted 30 seconds of them settling into a room that was entirely mine, on a floor with my name etched into the glass at the elevator bank, before anything else happened. Priya told me afterward that Diane had asked her, while pouring the coffee, how long she'd worked for Miss Whitfield, and whether the firm was a good place to build a career. Priya, who had no idea what was about to happen, said simply, "Best boss I've ever had." She remembers my kid's birthday every year. Small kindness, offered to a stranger who happened to be sizing up my office furniture. I've always liked that about Priya. She treats everyone the same whether or not she knows what's coming. When I walked in wearing a gray suit and carrying a folder with the Ridgeline logo on it, there was a full 4 seconds of silence. I counted them, the way I count most things under pressure. Frank's expression moved first, from professional pleasantness to confusion to something closer to alarm. Mark just stared. Diane, to her credit, recovered faster than either of them, though her recovery was a tight, brittle smile that didn't reach anywhere near her eyes. "Claire," Frank said, and it wasn't a greeting, it was a question. "Whack, Diane." "Mark," I said, and sat down across from them, opening my folder like I would for any other meeting. "I understand Ashworth Millwork is looking for a capital partner." Nobody spoke for what felt like a long time. Mark finally said, "You're Whitfield Capital?" "Ridgeline Partners," I said. "Whitfield is my name. It always has been." Diane found her voice next, and it came out with an edge she was clearly trying to file down in real time. "You never mentioned any of this to us." "You never asked," I said. I kept my tone flat and even, the way I'd walk a client through a quarterly report. In 4 years, nobody at that table asked me a single question about my work that wasn't followed immediately by a question about Mark's golf handicap. Frank had the decency to look down at that. Oh, Mark didn't. I opened the folder and slid 3 copies of Ridgeline's standard term sheet across the table, one to each of them, the same document I'd have prepared for any manufacturer in their position. $4.2 million, structured as a combination of senior debt and a minority equity stake, standard covenants, a board observer seat, an 18-month timeline to modernize the production line and refinance the existing lender. I walked them through it the way I read grievances to a board, factual, organized, line by line, no editorializing. This is the same offer I'd extend to any manufacturer with your fundamentals, I said. I've reviewed your public filings. Your production side is genuinely well run. Your capitalization is not. This term sheet fixes that, on standard terms, no different from what I'd give a stranger. Diane's composure finally cracked, just once, the way it had never cracked in front of me before in 6 years. You'd really do this, she said, and her voice, for the first time I could remember, didn't have any performance left in it. After everything, you'd actually help us. I'm not helping you, I said. I'm making an investment. There's a difference, and I think you, of all people, understand it better than anyone. She flinched at that. It was small, barely visible, but I saw it, the same way I'd once seen her flinch at a returned check she never expected back. For one honest second, something like fear or shame passed across her face, something real, unrehearsed. Then, exactly like every time before, she straightened her shoulders and reached for the version of herself that could survive this. We're still family, she said. Family takes care of family. I would think that still means something, whatever else has happened. You said something to me once, at your dining room table 4 years ago, I said, and I kept my voice level, almost gentle, because I wasn't trying to wound her, only to finish a sentence she'd started a long time ago. You told me I wasn't the reason Daniel was failing. You said I was just not reason enough for him to succeed. I've thought about that sentence more than you'd probably like to know. I let that sit in the room for exactly as long as it needed to. I'm not here for an apology, Diane. I'm here because your company has real value and I invest in real value. Those are two separate facts and I'd ask you not to confuse them. Mark leaned forward before Frank could answer, and I watched the version of him from that birthday dinner years earlier surface again, the one with the golf handicap comment ready before anyone else had finished eating. This is a little rich, Claire, you have to admit, he said. Sitting there with your name on the building, acting like you're doing us some kind of favor by following your own rule book. I'm not doing you a favor, I said. I already said that. I'm doing a deal. The two of you spent 9 days deciding how to approach me without telling me the equipment lender was already in default. I read that screenshot, Mark. I know exactly what your mother told you to leave out of the pitch. The room went quiet in a different way after that, the kind of quiet that comes when someone realizes the thing they thought was private wasn't. Mark's face went a shade paler. He didn't deny it. He didn't say anything else for the rest of the meeting. Frank spoke then, quietly, in a voice that had lost most of its bluster. I offered him a job that would have kept him near us. I told myself it was because I wanted him close. Some of it was that. He paused, and I watched him decide, in real time, whether to say the rest. Some of it was that I didn't like watching my son marry someone more capable than the family he came from. I'm not proud of that. I should have called more. I should have asked you a single question about your work in 6 years, and I never did. That was the crack Frank had never given me before either, small and real and immediately followed by nothing more. Because that's what an honest admission from a man like Frank looks like. Not a speech. One sentence, offered plainly, and then silence. Mark said nothing at all through most of this. When he finally spoke, it was only to ask, in a tight voice, whether the $4.2 million was still on the table. That told me everything I needed to know about which of them had actually heard anything I'd said. The offer stands, I said. On these terms. I don't extend family discounts, and I don't extend family penalties either. This is the same deal I'd give anyone. I closed my folder. What I won't do is pretend the last 4 years didn't happen, or pay some invisible tax for the privilege of being taken seriously by this family a year too late. The door opened quietly behind me. Daniel had been waiting in the small conference room down the hall, by prior arrangement in case anyone needed him, though we'd agreed he wouldn't join unless I asked. He hadn't been asked. He came in anyway, walked around the table, and stood behind my chair with one hand on my shoulder, saying nothing at all. He didn't need to. Diane looked at him standing there, steady and unbothered and entirely on my side of the table, and whatever she planned to say next, she didn't say it. Diane wasn't finished, though. She asked, in a voice that had recovered most of its usual polish, whether the board observer seat might go to her rather than to an outside advisor, since I've been closer to this business than anyone. I told her the seat required direct operational experience and would go to a manufacturing consultant Ridgeline had worked with on 2 prior deals, a decision made purely on qualifications. She asked again, a week later, over email this time, phrased as a suggestion rather than a request, and I declined again, in 3 sentences, polite and final. She never asked a third time. Frank asked one more question before they left that morning, quieter than anything else he'd said. He asked whether this meant Daniel might reconsider, someday, coming back to help run the company he'd once been meant to inherit half of. I told him that question wasn't mine to answer, and that if he wanted to know, he was welcome to ask his son directly, the way he should have been asking him things for years. Daniel, still standing behind my chair, said only, "Ask me again in a year, Dad. Ask me like you actually want to hear the answer, not like you're measuring me against Mark." Frank nodded, slowly, and didn't push further. It was the most honest exchange I'd ever watched the two of them have. I want to pause here because I know some of you are waiting for me to say I turned around and refused the deal out of spite. I didn't. Refusing wouldn't have proven anything except that I could be as small as they'd always assumed I was. What I refused was the framing. I signed the term sheet 3 weeks later, after standard diligence, on exactly the terms I'd offered that first morning. Not a dollar more, not a dollar less, and no board seat for Diane, which she asked for twice and I declined both times, politely, on the grounds that operational experience was a requirement for that seat and she had none. Due diligence turned up nothing that changed the offer, which didn't surprise me. The company really was what it looked like on paper, a well-run shop with an undercapitalized balance sheet run by people who'd made real mistakes with each other but hadn't made many with the machinery. Renata handled most of the closing logistics on the bank side, and to her credit never once asked why the family at the table had looked so uncomfortable that first morning. Some things don't need explaining to everyone. I told her the short version eventually over drinks months later, and she just shook her head and said, "You people and your family dinners." I didn't disagree. It's been 14 months since that meeting. Ashworth Millwork refinanced its debt, modernized its production line, and reported its first profitable quarter in 3 years last spring. Daniel's Tri-Haven Advisors now has 19 regular clients and, as of this January, its first full-time employee besides Daniel himself. Ridgeline crossed $240 million in assets under management this year, and I finally, for the first time in my career, put my own photo and my married name on the firm's website. Not because anyone asked, but because I decided I was done being a woman who succeeded quietly enough not to inconvenience anyone. Frank calls now, actually calls, about once a month, usually to ask a real question about the business and, increasingly, a real question about how I'm doing. 6 months ago he asked if I'd be willing to have coffee, just the two of us, no agenda. I said yes, on the condition that it be at a place of my choosing, and he agreed without hesitation. We've had coffee twice since. It's slow. It's careful. It's careful. Neither of us pretends the last 6 years didn't happen, but it's real. And I've come to believe that a small, honest thing built slowly is worth more than a large gesture built out of guilt. At the second coffee in March, Frank brought up the family portrait from that December card, unprompted, the one Daniel and I weren't in. He said he'd found the extra print in a drawer a few weeks earlier and hadn't been able to throw it away, not because he liked it, but because looking at it now made him uncomfortable in a useful way. A reminder of exactly how normal it had felt at the time to leave two people out of a photograph and call it an oversight. I didn't have much to say to that. I just told him I appreciated him noticing, which was true, and we moved on to talking about the production line upgrade, which was also true, and also, I think, exactly the kind of small mercy that lets two people keep having coffee instead of one grand reconciliation neither of us would have believed anyway. Diane has not called. She sent one message, through Frank, congratulating Daniel on Tri-Haven's growth, with no mention of Ridgeline, no mention of that morning in the conference room, no mention of the sentence she said to me at her own dining room table 4 years earlier. I don't expect that to change, and I've made a kind of peace with that. Some doors close because someone slams them. This one closed slowly, over 4 years, one dismissed question at a time, and I don't think either of us has the energy or the interest to reopen it now. Mark and I speak only when the deal requires it, which, under the board observer terms, is roughly once a quarter, and those calls are short, professional, and entirely about production numbers. He's good at his job. I've never disputed that. I've just stopped expecting him to be anything more to me than a business contact, and honestly, that's simpler for both of us than pretending otherwise. My own parents came to see the Ridgeline offices for the first time last fall, 6 years after I opened them. My mother, who kept those 3 sets of ledgers by hand at our kitchen table for 20 years, walked the floor slowly, reading the framed deal tombstones on the wall, and didn't say much until we were back in my office. Then she said, "Your father would have liked seeing this." My father passed the year before Daniel lost his job, and I think about that sometimes, how he never got to see any of this part, only the early, uncertain years. I keep a photo of him on my desk anyway, next to the quilt swatch Nana Lou sewed into a small frame for me, the Christmas after that meeting, a little corner of navy and gold, so I'd remember, she said, who showed up when it counted. Nana Lou still calls every Sunday at 4 o'clock. Last week, she asked me the same question she's asked for 6 years running. Tell me one good thing that happened this week. I told her about a client whose small manufacturing company just made its first hire in 8 years. She said that sounded like exactly the kind of good news the world could use more of. She's 90 now, still hemming pants out of that carriage house, still the only person in that family who never once asked me what I made or what I did with it, only whether I was sleeping enough. Daniel and I still eat dinner together most nights, at our own kitchen table, the same one where we celebrated month 36 and where he first told me not to soften anything for his family. That table has a small water ring near the edge from a coffee mug I set down wrong 6 years ago. I've never bothered to sand it out. Some marks are worth keeping around, as a record of exactly how far a thing has come. That's my story. 4 years, one green notebook, 24 items, and $4.2 million that finally made a family listen to a sentence I'd been ready to say for 6 years. The notebook sits in the bottom drawer of my desk now, next to a spare set of business cards that still say Whitfield, because that was always my name, and I stopped apologizing for it the morning I walked into my own conference room and let a family meet the person they'd spent 6 years deciding not to see. If there's one thing I'd want you to take from this, it's that being underestimated isn't a wound you have to spend your energy healing in public. You can just keep building quietly on your own terms and let the people who dismissed you find out the way everyone else finds out, on your schedule, not theirs. You don't owe anyone a performance of your progress just because they finally decided to pay attention. I don't think Diane ever set out to be cruel. I think she was frightened, in a way she never learned to name, of a world where her son's happiness didn't depend on staying close to her, and she picked me to blame because I was the easiest, most visible thing to point at. That doesn't excuse the 4 years. It just explains them, and there's a difference between excusing something and understanding it, the same difference I tried to explain to her across that conference table. I've made my peace with never getting an apology for that dining room table sentence. What I got instead was better proof than any apology could have offered: a company that survived, a marriage that held, and a green notebook I can finally put away. If this story resonated with you even a little, I'd love to hear your version of it in the comments. And if you want more stories like this one, calm, true, and about people who win by staying steady instead of getting loud, subscribe and stick around. There's more where this came from. That's my story, and I'll see you in the next one.